Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. There might be more folks joining us as we go along, but first, my name is Nick Merriam, and I am the CEO of sea.citi. Sea.citi is a network of tech and innovation companies that promote civic and community engagement together. We work with tech companies, both large and small, so our membership includes folks that you would expect, like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, as well as some of the mid-sized homegrown heroes like Tableau and Zillow. And we also have some rising stars amongst our group, including folks like Rover and Remitly. We launched our organization about a year and a half ago, and really in an effort to help better connect the 300,000 tech workers that reside in the greater Puget Sound area to local community. We know that a number of them are coming from other places, and we think Seattle is the best place and want to make sure that everybody is getting dialed in with the community as they get here and as they're working in one of the most important and exciting industries that we have in the area. So our normal programming is typically held on campuses at tech companies, and we have a history of facilitating these types of conversations. When the pandemic came, we took a break from in-person events, as you would think is appropriate. And now that things are starting to shift gears a little bit and people are starting to talk about what does opening look like, we developed this Roadmap to Recovery event series. It is designed to help you get really smart and educated about what's happening on the ground right now across a variety of community topics. So last week we were talking about climate change and sustainability. This week we're talking about transportation. Next week we're going to talk about homelessness and affordable housing. There are only 30 minutes, and if you like the conversation today, I hope you come back next week. It's every Thursday at noon. So with us today is Alex Hudson, who is the Executive Director of Transportation Choices Coalition, which was founded in 1993. Transportation Choices Coalition is a policy and advocacy nonprofit dedicated to making transportation accessible to all in Washington State. Alex is an advocate for people-centered planning and design who works strategically with a variety of planners to ensure transportation funding, policies, and systems create the most good for the largest number of people. So welcome, Alex. Super nice to have you here with us today. And maybe I just want to start with having you give a little bit of an overview of transportation choices.
Yeah, great. TCC is, as Nick said, we're a nonprofit organization, and we are focused on bringing transportation choices to people across Washington. So rather than being really focused in on specific kinds of projects, TCC centers our theory of change around big structural reform. So we're really interested in underlying legislation and policies that provide the funding for transit agencies and departments of transportation to be able to do their work, in addition to making sure that embedded within the agency frameworks are policies that make it easy and obvious to make better choices for transportation. So we try to get as upstream as possible because there is just an endless amount of detail you can go into on the topic of transportation, because every single one of us transports ourselves and the goods that we have throughout every part of our lives. So you may be familiar with TCC for running and winning some campaigns. We were instrumental in supporting Mass Transit Now, which is the campaign that got us ST3, which is Sound Transit's nation-leading build-out of light rail. We also work at the local level to do campaign work, but really the root of our work is in policy and focusing on Olympia. We're the only transportation advocacy organization with a daily presence in Olympia.
Great, thank you. So first up, I know a number of us have seen buses moving around and saying signs like essential trips only, bus ridership is definitely lower than it has been for a while. As the economy is starting to come back online, how is public transit really gearing up to serve people over the next couple of months?
Yeah, this is the question. So I like to root into current conditions. So there are 31 transit agencies across the state of Washington. The majority of their funding comes from local sales tax and fare box. And we're going to really focus in around King County Metro and Sound Transit in this conversation, since that's the area that most people are familiar with. King County Metro is still delivering 100,000 trips every single day. So while it is true that ridership is significantly declined, there are big disparities between how that looks on the route by route level. So if you go into communities that are low income or people of color-based communities, what we're seeing is that some of those routes, like the A line or the 7, look very much the same. Our more commuter routes that are tend to be to the north of King County and the north of Seattle are massive ridership declines. Same thing with Sound Transit. So I like to remind ourselves that transit is a core function of how many people either get to their jobs or get where they need to go. If you relied on transit before this pandemic, you are still relying on transit now. You didn't just like go out and buy a car. So that's true, and that there are disparities in who is on transit. Transit agencies have implemented a lot of best practices. So you've seen the elimination of fares. Transit's free right now. You have to board through the back door. They're increasing cleaning. They're doing spacing, so you can't sit in certain aisles or in certain seats. And the new introduction of passenger load limits. So transit buses right now have either, depending on the size of the bus, either between 12 or 16 people allowed on the bus. So you may have seen buses rolling by that say full. Drivers are not picking up people on those routes. As we're thinking about the return to ridership, knowing that there's still a lot of riders there, thinking about best practices for the agency. So that includes things like mandatory face covering on transit, and all of those other policies. One of the things as we're dialing back towards normal is the return of fares. So you'll see that Sound Transit is going to start collecting fares June 1st, but at a reduced rate. So the fare will actually just be $1 as opposed to the $2.50 or $2.75 that it was before. This is informed by two things. One is, what is the demand? What are, thinking about essential trips and essential riders, but on their choice trips and commuter trips, how much are people going to be returning to the office? How much are people going to be returning to transit? 25% of adults in Washington state can't or don't drive. So there is an underlying need that for mobility that will continue to exist. So part of it is a big unknown on the demand side. And then the other piece is a pretty scary known, which is where we're at with funding. So as I said, most of transit funding comes from local source. So sales tax is about 80% and fares are about 20%. Fares have been zeroed out. So that's a 20% budget cut across the board. Sales tax is on the decline. So we're still learning now what the overall financial need is going to be as agencies balance the need to deliver service, knowing that we're heading into a recession, and that is a time when people are looking for an affordable transportation option, as well as the need to have enough service that creates opportunity for social distancing. Buses used to have 50, 60 people on them. Now, if we're maxing out at 16, how do you increase the service when you're down revenue? So it's a real pickle that a lot of the agencies are in. They've received federal dollars through CARES Act, but we know it's nowhere near meeting the actual need.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about the role that sales tax and revenue sources play in maintaining our public transit. One other question for you is the Seattle Transportation Benefit District comes due this fall. I can't imagine people sort of being excited about new taxation or what they might view as new taxation. How do you think the Transportation Benefit District is gonna fare this fall time? What's gonna play out there?
Yeah, that is a very active and timely conversation. So I'll just run through funding real quick and then we'll dig in. So
Yeah,
a
great.
very limited number of dollars for transit comes from the federal government. Most of that is for big capital. So you'll see that Donald Trump was tweeting about allocating money towards Sound Transit this week. So that's mostly for capital projects. Our state money is very limited. In fact, only 7% of state transportation dollars go towards what we call multimodal money. So that's everything from sidewalk improvements, bicycle infrastructure and improvements, and transit service capital and program, which is the three kind of buckets of transit funding. So it's limited from the state as well. So we really rely on local dollars to fund those 31 transportation agencies. And here in Seattle, there is a special tax measure that voters approved in 2014 called the Seattle Transportation Benefit District. And that had been a combination of 0.1% sales tax and $80 in car tabs that together were able to create by 350,000 extra hours from King County Metro, who delivers transit service. A huge part of our national success. You may know that here in Seattle, we had been bucking national trends and really leading the way towards increased ridership and delivering amazing service. 70% of people in Seattle are within a 10-minute walking distance of 15-minute or better service. This is numbers matched really only by New York and San Francisco. That is up for renewal. 976 passed last fall, which removed car tabs, leaving us in a very hard place to even start from. And then on top of that, sales tax being down and voters not really being super excited necessarily about taxes. And from a structural and values place, really not thinking that sales tax, which is known to be extremely regressive, is either fair and equitable, progressive, or what we're seeing right now, stable and resilient. So there's a huge question about that. The question is if we're going to renew in this November, or if we can renew later in the spring, we can get a better understanding of both demand and where the agency is going to be at, and what that money will go for. Right now, STBD buys a lot of service hours, and it helps create awesome programs. So you may know that every high school student in the city of Seattle receives a free Orca card. So we have program as part of that, and then there's capital, bus lanes, better shelters, some of the things that make transit both enjoyable and efficient. So the question is, when, if we renew, when that renewal would happen, and what we're going to be spending that money on, knowing that we lost an important tool. And so the revenue itself is already more limited than it was before. Those conversations, as I said, are extremely active and are happening right now. So I would encourage everybody who really cares about this issue to be paying attention to their city council, who will be making that decision.
Yeah, and just quick clarification on that, when will city council be talking about those things, and how would people be involved?
So there's some questions about Open Public Meetings Act adjustment that the governor has put in. As you may well know, governments are not allowed to be holding meetings about big new issues right now because there isn't the same kind of public participation that there was before. So they will need to put that on the ballot. So the way a bill happens is the executive's office, the mayor, brings legislation down, city council does its thing, they debate it, they amend it, they make sure it aligns with their constituents' needs and values, and then they put it to the clerk, who puts it on the ballot. It needs to be to the clerk by August 5th. So that conversation will be happening in the month of July and June. The best place to stay informed about that is your local media. Seattle Times, Erica Barnett covers a lot of transportation issues. Crosscut talks about this. And just to stay informed about what your city council is doing and to be active about that.
Yeah, great tips. We love Crosscut over here at sea.citi. They do fantastic local reporting. Quick plug for them. So I'm going completely off script at this point, and I want to ask you one other quick question, and then we've got at least one question from the audience. So the other question is, Seattle has now shut down 20 miles of streets for calling them safe streets, I believe is the term that they used. But they're shut down to traffic. They said that they're going to keep them possibly permanently shut down. When you start looking at sort of the changes in human behavior that happen as from more robust work from home policies and activities like shutting down streets, potentially decreased funding, sort of, are we going to see like radical shifts in the way in which our region thinks about transportation or routes? Does this end up sort of looking at ST3 and rethinking how that works? I mean, talk to us a little bit about the long-term implications of what's happening right now.
Yeah. We're definitely going to be seeing some changes at Sound Transit. We'll start there. Sound Transit anticipates that this is costing them $640 million. And that's just like with what they know today. And so if we're keeping going down, that could change. As a reminder, it's a $54 billion investment, but they're starting that program realignment conversation right now. And so that could potentially be projects that either get canceled or delayed. We're fighting like hell to make sure that doesn't do the capital, but things like maybe some of the big parking structures, can we cancel or delay those? Long range, I mean, I certainly hope that this is portending a revolution in how we get around in this country, because we are on a crash course for destruction. People cannot afford a vehicle and auto-based society the way that we have now. Before this, 7 million people were 3 months behind or more on their auto loans. Before this, transportation is the second highest household income cost for households. And we know that commute time is the single biggest predictor of escaping poverty. So right now our transportation system, which is oriented around the car, isn't working for people. And we know that the big crisis that's coming, and in fact is already here, is our climate crisis, transportation being the single biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in Washington state. So I am thrilled to be seeing these slow streets projects. So shout out to Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, who have been leading that for a long time. You may have seen in the New York Times, like, bicycles are just sold out across the country. Like, you can't buy a bike hardly at all in the United States, as people are looking to bicycling as an alternative form of both transportation and exercise. I think the inevitability is that people are noticing that when you're in a community that meets your needs and resources, like if you've got a grocery store and you're working from home, your mobility needs are more oriented at that neighborhood scale. So I definitely see some positives coming out of this. And I'll also say that there are some negatives. People are wigged out about getting on transit. And I think that that's really real for people. And so there was a recent article in the City Lab that says that, like, we can just anticipate more traffic jams, higher levels of congestion coming out of this, as some people who have a choice are going to choose to take their cars. I like to remind people, it's 250,000 jobs in downtown Seattle and 34,000 parking spots. So even if everybody wanted to drive, we just simply do not have the room for that. So there's some pros. And there are definitely some things coming that we need to really get ahead of.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift over to some questions from the audience. I think the first two questions that I'm seeing are really about feeling safe on transit. So one is referencing how we make sure people do indeed feel safe so they can return to using public transit. While the second question asks more about a student perspective that they do rely on public buses to get to school, and worries about, if the bus only has 16 folks on it or already has 16 folks on it, how do they make sure that they're not late for school? I will also say that assumes school goes back into in-person session. That's a conversation for another day. But maybe can you talk in a little bit more depth about what people can do around feeling safe using public transit?
I mean, I think the most important thing is that public transit agencies are looking to public health to back that. Public transit agencies do not need to be making up new best practices or policies right now. They need to be listening and being guided by the excellent expertise coming from our public health department. So to me, that's first and foremost. I think, and this is really a question I have for the audience. What would make people feel like returning to transit for them, if they're transit registered before this, would feel safe? I think the agencies are going to need to be really clear about continuing the high level of cleaning that is happening on the buses. I think that mandatory face covering policies are going to need to be implemented. There's some design work that can be done around ensuring that there's good airflow and air circulation on buses. Open window policies will probably be sticking around for a while. And then these rider limits questions. But this is all still very in development right now. So again, I would be curious what all the participants hear their wisdom, like what would make you feel like transit was an option for you again?
Yeah, and when you and I spoke prior to this, one of the things that we talked about was a great action that anybody on this call can take is if you do get an ORCA card or have any transit benefits through your company, making sure to loop back to whoever's in charge of that or whoever's facilitating that process and let them know what would make you feel safe on public transit. And because that's a great feedback loop. And now I'm just talking on Alex's talking points, but that's a great feedback loop for the transit authorities. Another quick question, and I think this might be the last one. This is coming from Cynthia, and she says, as ridership declines for many commuters, will transit resources be more heavily directed to providing resources for essential workers?
Yeah, I think if the question is, so there's going to be some service realignment, right? They're going to be looking at how do we don't have enough money, right, to do what we were doing before. So how do we prioritize? TCC is working right now with our big coalition of community organizations, nonprofit organizations, urbanists, businesses, labor, to figure out how we do that. And we're developing a framework around values. One thing I will say is like King County Metro is just like an astoundingly amazing agency as it relates to having rider-centered values. They are absolutely leading the country in their progressive understanding of mobility as a human right. And they state that as an agency, which is a far cry from what many people across this country experience. Yeah, I mean, we need to deliver service to the people who need it. And right now we know the same thing to be true, which is the people who need it are essential workers. Public transportation right now is what we're seeing is what we knew before is it is a foundational pillar of a functioning society. Essential workers who right now are the people that we are relying on to be able to like eat food rely on public transportation. So we need to be prioritizing in areas where we're measuring and seeing consistent and in fact sometimes growing transit ridership. And we need to be ensuring that we're putting that towards places where there's higher low-income people, people of color, elderly people, disabled people, all the folks for whom transit is not a choice. It is their best option. So I anticipate that we'll be seeing some of that. What's interesting, and I think folks here might be really thinking about, is if we're going to be sort of limited in our ability to bring transit to people, what are the tools and resources that we can have to get people to transit? And that is where some really interesting work and technology companies like Lime and Uber are at, and Bird are doing micromobility pilots. So bicycle share, scooter share, via programs that help close what we call in the biz the first last mile problem. Knowing like, gosh, maybe because of down revenue for a while, that might be the first and last like mile and a half or 2 miles for a while. So what are other ways that we can do infill to get people to transit? Because we know it works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Alex, we've come to the end of our very brief half hour. I really want to thank you for joining us. We love transportation choices and glad that you were able to show up today and give everybody some details on what's going on. We want to drop information about transportation choices into the chat. So if you're on Twitter, I would encourage you to follow them. I would encourage you to sign up for their newsletter. They are a wealth of information about transportation and will help keep you informed. Thank you all very much for coming. Like I said, next week, next Thursday at noon, half an hour, we will be talking about homelessness and affordable housing with Wellspring Family Services. It'll be a great conversation. If you aren't on our newsletter, get on our newsletter so that way you can get invites directly. And thank you so much for everybody taking time out of your day to jump on this call.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Stay well.
Wash those hands. Bye.